welcome, and it's good to see some new faces here today. I'm Kristen Kloppenstein. I'm a senior researcher with the Texas Skills Project here at UT Dallas, and today we're joined by Cliff Adelman, who is currently a senior associate with the Institute for Higher Education Policy in DC, and there he plays a senior role in research projects focusing on assessment, higher education access, and student mobility. And this is in addition to topics he has focused on throughout his career, including degree completion rates, standardized testing, transfer patterns, and the role of community colleges. So prior to joining the Institute for Higher Education Policy, Cliff was at the Department of Ed for nearly 30 years as a senior research analyst. And he contributed to key background studies of the high school curriculum in A Nation at Risk, and he designed the higher education follow-up to that report, Involvement in Learning, which served as a platform for the assessment movement in higher ed in the 1990s. During his tenure at the Department of Ed, he authored several studies that served as benchmarks in education and set agendas for policymakers, including my personal favorite, Answers in the Toolbox, about academic intensity, attendance patterns, and bachelor's degree attainment. It was a seminal report on the impact of high school curriculum on college success, and it continues to have impact today. I was just discussing it in Atlanta yesterday again. Cliff received his PhD from the University of Chicago, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Cliff Adelman.
Thank you, Kristen. It's been a delight to be here at UT Dallas. This is my first visit to this part of Dallas anyway, and to learn about, and we spent a lot of time on her work at lunch, and it was pretty exciting stuff that I think deserves a greater audience than, well, it deserves an audience. You got to get it out there. And I think that the work in this group is rather important. I think I share that at home with my wife, who is also attached to the same projects and as an evaluator out of SRI International. That's a different story. We keep this is, well, it's pillow talk. We keep it separate in our directions. I'm going to get on this particular topic today for you, and the rules of engagement is that you can interrupt me at any time with burning questions. Just make sure I smell the smoke first. You know, you want to make a speech later. But part of the themes of my work reflect the very first article I published the minute I got out of government, which was a front page on the Chronicle of Higher Ed Review called The Propaganda of Numbers. And that's in use in a variety of places. And it's something that's always bugged me, but you couldn't say anything when you were a government employee about this. And the minute I got out, and actually I started before I got out, and they didn't particularly like what I had to say at a conference. I won't get into all of what they did, but the minute I got out, I published the thing, and this is a continuing aspect of that particular path of work that I think all of us in education have to be aware of. Namely, we've got, first of all, communication channels to a variety of audiences that we haven't mapped thoroughly and don't understand how they influence policy and behavior. And I think it's a big neglect in our research. It isn't quantitative so much, except for if you do content analysis, it is. And I've done that, my share of that too, in looking at textual environments. But now we've got all kinds of communication channels that are flying around. Where audiences pick up the information that they pick up and what they buy and why is rather important to our assessment of our future success. So that's no matter what policy area we're in. So that's one aspect of this thing that's rather important. The other strain of my interest that the U.S. Department of Ed would not allow me to deal with was international. And we went in higher education, which is my principal stomping ground, we were paying no attention whatsoever to the Bologna process in Europe, which started in 1999. For those of you who don't know about it, it now involves 46 countries from Cork to Vladivostok, as they say, everybody agreeing to reform their higher education systems so that they look alike and so that students can move across borders a lot more easily. And the core of this involves a different way of thinking about what a degree means in terms of stated learning outcomes for students, different credit system, which is based not in faculty contact hours, but student workload. Boy, that's a 180-degree turn from the way in which we think about things. Something called a diploma supplement, which is not a transcript, but which is added to a description of what you did to earn the degree that you have, and a quality assurance system that wraps the whole thing up in one bundle. It hasn't been moving as smoothly as some people would like. Some countries were late to the table. There were 29 originally, expanding to 46. Some countries are having difficulty with certain aspects of it, but it's bottom up. It's bottom up. It's owned by the faculty. We're doing something with pieces of it in the U.S. You can ask me about that later. And what it proves is that massive higher education reform is possible, folks. And it's possible across borders, and it's being imitated in other parts of the world. 18 countries in Latin America picked up one aspect of it, and all the countries in the Maghreb and the rest of Francophone West Africa have picked up the degree cycles. And Australia is picking up pieces. There is some reason to pay attention. And we were asleep at the wheel for a long time. We are now registered for the course. Right now, we are going to look, however, at a correlate to all of this, because we always start out with this statement about how poorly U.S. education is doing compared to those systems in other countries. We love self-flagellation in this country. We really do. Come on, beat me up some more. Every report announcement we're doing poorly, and usually we're compared to OECD countries, other advanced industrial, post-industrial democracies. And it's become a religion. And so we've got a liturgy. And you've got to start with saying we've fallen from X position to Y position in some beauty contest out there in terms of the numbers of people who have the proportions of population have degrees, numbers of beginning students who graduate, et cetera, et cetera. We love to compare the U.S. I'm going to remind you, I forget which slide it is, but let's see. Let's continue. We love to compare the U.S., a country of 310 million people with a very interesting passenger list as the biggest ship in the harbor. We love to compare us with our performance with Denmark, which is a country of 5 million people, where 91% of them are of Danish ancestry, and would you believe 86% belong to the same church? I mean, that's supposed to be a fair comparison. We've got a Bible. It's called Education at a Glance. I'm sure you all use it from OECD. You've got 300 international organizations. Try to take all the data from different countries and put them together and promulgate the beauty contests. They're supposed to observe. Yes, sir.
Back on that point, aren't there some good reasons for doing that? That is to say, if you want to get published, you point out something that's controversial, and if you want to continue increasing levels of funding, you point out issues like we have done historically since the 80s.
To which my answer is we've done it so often that we're numb to it. I mean, when we become, you know what happens with liturgies? You can recite them without thinking about them. I can point to various prayers that people say, churchgoers here, that you say and hymns that you can sing without even thinking about them. And you just do. And that's what's happened with the repetition of this kind of statement at the beginning. We always do it. We think it's going to goad people to do better. All right? And what I'm saying is that when you'll see in this presentation, when you look at this more closely, we're not answering the critical policy questions with a beauty contest. That's not what's of concern to all participating countries. Okay, we've got a PR operation out of OECD. We assume this came down from Mount Sinai, and because all of this stuff came down from Mount Sinai, it's true. You remember the joke about Moses walking down with 3 tablets and dropped one? Okay, whoops, Okay, contents, and we always lose the beauty contest. You know that, because they like to beat up the big guy. They really, and we are the big guy. And one thing that you'll find out in a moment, if you didn't know it already, we're getting bigger and they're not. As a matter of fact, a lot of them are shrinking. Okay. I'm not going to claim all is well with U.S. higher ed. Participation is high, but it's imbalanced. Bachelor's degree, okay, but we could do better. Our associate's degree completion rates are miserable, and I'm working on a project on that right now. You can ask about that later. And that we can't tell you what a degree means outside of the fact that everybody in this room, I assume, has a bachelor's degree, which means I know you earned at least 120 credits and had at least a 2.5 GPA, and that's all I know. And that doesn't mean a damn thing. And that's what we learned from the Europeans. It's all beside the point when we get to comparative indicators. Okay, now, yeah.
You know accreditation.
Accreditation will take a part in this. You'll see where. Okay, and you can ask and you can zero in on more of that later. Now I have some sympathy, and this is in light of the original question, about any transnational agency that tries to put all the data together that they're getting in many languages from Helsinki and from Lisbon and from Athens, and we know how Athens, if you read the economic news, inflates things anyway, and Ottawa, which definitely inflates things. Even OECD acknowledges that Canadian data are inflated, and from Seoul, et cetera, et cetera. I have sympathy for them because they got to find common elements or aggregations in all of this, and they try to find analogs that will cross borders, and they get common bracket classifications, and it ain't an easy job. And what I will also claim, however, is that they don't always do a good job. And matter of fact, the World Bank has recognized this, Eurostat has recognized this. They're working parties to try to do a better job than they're doing. We're having a meeting at the World Bank. I've been called to, it's surprising they called me, next week after next, where I'm going to bring the case of data reconciliation to the table, which is something that's long overdue across these agencies, even though they're supposed to observe the same rules. They don't. Okay, first problem that we run into is the language landscape. I can testify to this having done 3 Bologna studies using 8 languages. Now, could I speak and read all of those 8 languages? No, I could handle 3 of them. And the other 5 I had to ask for help. And when you get into statistical analyses and you go on the websites of the statistical agencies in other countries where they have table generators, you have to know what the various technical terms mean, and it helps if you have friends in Sweden and the Netherlands and Portugal, et cetera, even though I can read some Portuguese. The other stuff, the Swedish and Dutch, even with my German, you can't do it. You really needed people to tell you what these terms meant. And sometimes it was difficult. Sometimes I had a translator next to me, too. And when they couldn't figure it out, I had to send an email to somebody I knew in another country. Please look at this. And some of them couldn't figure it out either. I said, wait a second. You're over there now. Tell me, you're in that system. All right. Second principle. Look at the coverage of the different transnational accounts. UNESCO and the World Bank presumably cover everybody, so you could separate out developing from developed nations. Eurostat's got 27 countries of the European Union. OECD is now, it's 31 now. Chile is now in the OECD. So, but in the past, and that's the first country in Latin America to be in the OECD. So that's rather important. And I think you also, when you get to these data, you've got to take a look at the data you're getting, the demographic data, which you'll see in a minute from the Migration Policy Institute and the Pew demographic studies that Rick Fry does and others, because otherwise you're not going to have a sense of how to interpret any of it. And take a look at the overlaps. Third issue, a context. And OECD doesn't tell you an education glance about context. Volatility and time series data. What Finland did in the 1990s was the equivalent of, in this country, of opening 600 brand new 4-year colleges. That's what it would have been in the U.S. And in isolated areas, a friend of mine in Finland says, "What are you talking about isolated areas? The whole country is isolated." But but they did open polytechnics, or AMKs as they call them in Finland, 11 of them. And in the Finnish higher education system, that's the equivalent of 600 new 4 years. Ask you type institutions in this country. So your time series data for Finland will look really bloated or distorted in the 1990s. Massification periods. The U.S. has been in the massification business in higher ed since 1972. A lot of these countries came to it later, and I'm going to remind you, and it's a theme through all of this, is this history that people forget. That if you're looking at the European countries, there's a whole bunch of them that had to spend time, at least a decade, if not more, digging out from the rubble of World War II before they got to establish reestablish a university system, and then a whole bunch of them were in dictatorships that some people forget. This is basic history. I'll get back to that. So a lot of people forget there was a guy called Franco in Spain, and next door Salazar in Portugal, and Spain underwent 3 restructurings of its education system in the past 50 years. And obviously that's going to affect what went on in Spanish universities that OECD is not going to tell you when you start taking a look at when we got around to massification. The systematic credential restructuring of the Bologna process. The Europeans used to offer only, your first degree was like a long 5-year or 6-year degree. Bologna says no. First they said we're going to have undergraduate and graduate degrees, and we're going to have a marker between the two. Would you believe they didn't do that before? 1999? And then they said, wait a second, there's 2 kinds of graduate degrees. There's a master's and then a doctorate, but initially we're going to focus on bachelor, master. And they said, the bachelor's degree will be no less than 3 years, and the master's degree will be no less than 2. So most people went on a 3+2 system, but that's not universal across Europe. The Brits are still on, Brits as opposed to the Scots. Those are 2 separate higher education authorities. In case you didn't know, you just found out. Brits were on 3 years plus 3-year bachelor's plus 1-year master and still are. The Scots are on 4+2. That's the same UK crew. In Germany, what are called the Fachhochschulen, which are the ASCII type institutions, are on 3.5, 1.5, whereas the universities are 3+2. All of them have exceptions for medicine, which you enter directly from high school, 6 years. By the way, every student in Europe, and we'll get back to this, who enters medical school directly from high school has already had organic chemistry and molecular biology in high school. I can count the number of U.S. high schools that offer both those courses on these fingers. And I'm not sure how many of them are public, but that's another story. Medicine is always longer. Engineering and architecture are always longer in certain ways, and depending on the country you're in. We can talk about the variations in that, but these affect data. They affect how data changes. In Bologna, if under Bologna, which was the agreement was 1999, but the new degree structures didn't start coming on until 2003, 4, 5. You don't start seeing the graduates, and all of a sudden you see the number of college graduates in Norway jump up, like by 10, 15%. Guess what? They went from 5-year bachelor's, first-year degrees, first cycle degrees is what they call them, to 3-year bachelor's. Boom, up you go. Same thing, Czech Republic. These kinds of things have an impact. Eastern Europe. One day everybody woke up in 1989 and they discovered the dictator was gone. And they were walking around in a daze. Everything became problematic when the dictator goes. I mean, before, you were told what you were going to do tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Afterwards, you'd have to turn around and say, wait a second, there's nobody to tell me what to do at 10 o'clock, and I got to figure this out. It took the countries of Eastern Europe, a lot of them, and some of them are still not done with this, a decade or more to restructure their higher education systems, their education systems in general, and to figure out where the devil they were going with it. Pre-collegiate structure rules and their coming changes. Germany, in case you don't know, is about to go from 13 years pre-collegiate schooling to 12. And boy, and each of the German states, Germany is a federal republic like ours, and the states in Germany, the Länder, as they're known, have considerable power. They're the ones in education. This is not true in other places. There are very few countries where federal systems where the states have power. Spain is another one with autonomous regions. They have less power. The Canadian provinces are enough to drive everybody in Canada up a wall. In terms of the federal government in Canada is even less powerful in education than ours. The German Länder are changing over from 13 years to 12 and in a staggered schedule. Is not even a schedule, it's when they want it to be. That's going to change the population in Germany going on to higher education and completing, and which, by the way, is the lowest percentage of any advanced industrial economy of people completing first cycle degrees. And for those of you who believe that there is an unbreakable connection between education and the economic vitality, I don't notice the German economy being hurt that badly by it, but that's another story. We can get into that later. National habits. Age of higher education entrance. The Scandinavians are wonderful with this. When you take that look at the age distribution of entering students in higher education in Sweden and Denmark and Finland, etc., a lot of them are 25, 26. You say, what's going on here? Well, there's something called gap years in Scandinavian countries, and it's a typical habit. In Finland, it occurs because in college entrance exam, which is mandatory, only 40% of the students pass. So they take off for a few years to, no doubt, drink a little. They do a lot of that in Finland. Have some fun and study for the next round of the college entrance exam, and then they enter school at age 23, 24. The Finns are the oldest bachelor's degrees on average in the world. Swedes come close right after that, Danes as well. So you've got this gap years. When you ask the statistical agency in Sweden or Denmark, how come? How do you explain this? Gap years, okay, and they know what that means. Whereas in France, for example, and Italy, if you're not entering directly at age 18 out of school, you're in another universe. That's very traditional. Basic history, South Korea. They love to pull this one on us. OECD loves it, and the commentators, this is part of the propaganda, compare the proportion of people with college degrees from the older age group, 55 to 64, with the younger age group, 25 to 34, and look at the spectacular rise for South Korea. And aren't they on top of the world? And I turned around and I said, I always ask people, now this room, a lot of you weren't born yet. I said, but where were you in June of 1950? Were you in school? I say this to older people. I was in school in June 1950. I asked them, was your school year interrupted? No, there sure was. As a matter of fact, they were on a 3-year involuntary vacation known as the Korean War. And after that, there was another 6 years of rubble to clear before they had an education system that was functioning. And after that, there was another until 1964 before the first community college opened in Korea, which is now, the community college system there is now enrolling about 40% of Koreans who are going on to higher education. And it wasn't until the 1980s that they had a massification. So no wonder the younger generation, let's put it this way, the older generation had a miserable attainment rate. If you couldn't go to school for 3 years and then struggle to find a school for 6 years after that, you wouldn't have a great attainment rate either. So these are the kinds of contextual issues in reading international data that I think people ought to be aware of. Yes, sir?
Well, I haven't heard you mention one huge one. From my understanding, Italy, tuition is free.
Tuition is not only free in Italy, it is unthinkable in France, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, for example. There is no tuition. It's an unthinkable concept. But that's always been the case. So the issue is always something else. in terms of change in patterns. And when we're talking about this country, one of the reasons we analyze data in terms of low-income populations in higher education is because we got a dollar sign on every college and community college door. They don't. That's not true in, I won't say every country. The tuitions that have been introduced in the UK, in Germany, for example, are modest tuitions. Canada, Japan, Korea all have tuitions. But there are a whole bunch of countries where tuition is an unthinkable concept, and there are national student grants. You know, they're living. We can get to that, cost of living grants. We'll get to that. Okay. I'm reminding these people when we interpret time series data that of the 30 OECD countries, now of the 31, I'm going to change this. I'm going to say 31, 16, because I think we got to remember Pinochet in Chile, now that Chile's on board, experienced either war on their own soil, dictatorships climbing out of the rubble, or World War II. That's the list. And education at a glance, your Bible, my friends, does not acknowledge any of this. And I consider that absolutely irresponsible. Data reporting would not be allowed in this country, not by the National Center for Education Statistics. Okay, here are some questions we got to ask across all of these data. Where's the population growing? By how much? What age groups? Where's the population decreasing? Principal factors. What are the factors in population trends? We're into the demographic territory here. Growth rates, death rates in particular, fertility, net migration, and what are the likely effects of those on all our education readings? Let's take a look at some data. I said there'd be no data here, but there are. Would you take a look at that? First, we're going to take a look at everybody where the change number is in red. This is for the projected changes to the 25 to 34-year-old age group, which is the age at which we commonly reach a conclusion as to the proportion of the population that's completed higher education. Okay, that's why I pick it, and that's what projections, demographic projections look like. Japan is going to lose about a quarter in that age group. This stuff, they're not fooled. This is serious business because principally of the fertility rate, they ain't got no migration to speak of. I mean, who's coming into Japan, et cetera. By the way, South Korea is in the same ballpark. Less of a change. They're going to lose about 20% of this population, but also for reasons of low fertility, principally, and no net migration. The Russians are going to get creamed. And I think everybody knows this, and there have been recent articles about really exploring this in some depth. They got a huge death ratio, much there. That's why the growth rate is a minus percentage. The ratio of Russian men to women is like 80 to 100, and the divorce rate is 60%. The childbearing rate is low. There are fertility issues, severe infertility issues, despite all the encouragement of the Russian government to have special family holidays, stay home, have sex, make babies, and that hasn't worked much. Poland, same kind of thing. In Eastern Europe, you're going to find this a lot. Now, let's go down the bottom. North America. 3 different growth stories in North America. These are all OECD countries. Mexico has a high change rate because of fertility. It's 1% growth in change, 2.1 in fertility, but they have a negative net migration rate, and guess where they're going? Okay, so you turn around, then you go to Canada, you have the inverse story. You've got a high net migration rate and a low fertility rate, and so you've got growth, but it's not the same. The U.S. across the board, among all OECD countries, is not only the biggest ship in the harbor, it's hitting the top 4, top 5 in all of these measures of population change. And you can say that we tie with Mexico in fertility, and we're about 4th in net migration, and we're going to move up to 3 because Ireland was there, and now everybody's going home from Ireland because of the economic changes in the Irish economy, et cetera. And we're even going to lose some in Canada. People are not coming here. But all of this affects the way we're going to have to read what's going to happen in education and higher education in the different countries. And you don't need more than 4th grade math to figure it out. I mean, that's part of my point. Let's take another one. This is the 4th grade math. Okay, hang on, let me go back. 4th grade math. What happens to participation rates when the denominator declines and the numerator, which is always, the demographers will tell you is always in a lag, doesn't decline as fast? What happens? Percentage of participation goes up through the wall, through the ceiling. Same thing with completion. And what happens when the denominator grows and the numerator isn't catching up as fast? That's us, kids. No matter what we do, our participation and completion rates are not going up compared to the other countries. I don't care what the president says. I don't care what the liturgy that we recite says we've fallen from X place to Y place. Guess what? You're going to fall some more. Has nothing to do with what you do. And part of my point is, that's not the point anyway, because there are 3 bigger issues, which we'll get to, that we have to consider in education fate after high school. Okay. I point to all of these features once again and reinforce them in terms of where our position is likely to go. Let me focus on the last one for a moment. They don't call them associate's degrees except in the Netherlands and in Canada, Japan, and Korea. Otherwise, they're called short cycle degrees. Okay, not all countries offer them. Those that do include Australia, France, where they're traditional, what's called the Diplôme Universitaire de Technologie, which is a very interesting degree. Why? Because it's offered by an institution that's across the street from a university to which it's married. Do you think the completion rates are low under those circumstances compared to our community colleges? No, they're rather high. The UK's got one that started in, by UK I mean England, Wales, Northern Ireland, or UNI as it's known, as opposed to Scotland, has one they started in the year 2000 called the foundation degree. The foundation degrees are offered jointly by a university and a further education college, which is, it's not the equivalent of our community college, but for our argumentative purposes, let's say it is. Guess what happens to their graduates? 54% of them go on to the university for honors bachelor's degrees, et cetera, et cetera. When you have that kind of relationship, it's very different from the American Community College, which has taken on 6 missions. It's not merely transfer. It's not merely degree completion. They're also responsible for ESL. They're responsible for remediation. They're responsible for continuing education. They're responsible for adult basic. They'll take on any one of those missions. So it's one of the factors that is in the way of our associate's degree production. I'll tell you about another one because I'm working on this project now as a pilot. We discovered, and it's based on my research when I was with the department on using national data sets, the transcript-based national data sets, that roughly 4% of entering community college students sounds small, but it ain't when you add up the numbers, qualified for an associate's degree but never received one. So we've asked, well, what happened was we got one community college district in 2002, after I came out with it, San Diego Miramar. Miramar was one of the San Diego divisions, to examine its own records and find students who academically qualified for an associate's degree and never got it, and then ask, why didn't we get the degree awarded? And what they found were the following. Student didn't pass the swimming test or other physical education requirement. A student owed $150 in library fines, and we held up the degree. Our student didn't know they were eligible for an associate's degree because we never told them, and so they had to file a piece of paper to get it. Student knew about it but didn't want to pay the $50 with the paper to get it. Student had already transferred to a 4-year college and didn't give a damn about the associate's degree. What San Diego Miramar then wound up doing was wiping out all the red tape, canceling all the fines, and the associate's degree completion rate went up 17% in one semester. Now, granted, that was a pop, but they learned what they had to look for. We've got now, and it's really interesting, and I'll have a report on this spring, under a subcontract from the Ed Trust, which has money from Gates and Lumina and whoever. I've got 7 community colleges in 4 states, plus in the case of Louisiana, I've got 3 four-year colleges that award associate's degrees in this, who are doing the same kind of tracking and trying to figure out, we're discovering all the problems that arise when you try to do this, and your data systems have changed, and I can't even follow you from 2002 to 2007 because I went from Blackboard to something else in 2005 or whatever software I was using. It's unbelievable. We got FERPA questions that New York overrode, I was telling Kristen at lunch, by issuing new random ID numbers to all the students in the state. And that's the way they got around it, and then they could do, it was a way to find a truce between the IT people and the IR people in order for them to, I'm only working with 2 community colleges in New York, but they're big ones, and they came up, one of them came up with an initial cut of close to 4,000 students who fell in the bin of people over the past, they used 2001 to academic year entry to the present, who fell in the bin of more than 60 X credits and higher than 2.5 GPA and whatever that qualify for an associate's degree. And then you've got to track what happened to these people. If they've transferred, they're out of there. If they've earned a degree elsewhere, they're out of there, and you're boiling it down until you get it. Anyway, there's a lot of that that's going to influence our future data. If we get this pilot successful, and if it's replicated to scale across 1,200 community colleges in this country, you'll find our associate's degree completion rates rising. Here are my examples of the short cycle productivity in France, the IUT graduation rate, the foundation degree. We don't see anything like this in education at a glance. This is called vertical penetration, and we don't see it from undergraduate, bachelor's to master's level either. The Germans can produce that data, sort of. We certainly can and do. But you don't get it anywhere else. You don't get it from Canada. Canada's miserable. They don't even know how many first-time students they have. You'll see that in a minute, too. It's amazing about the data quality that feed into this, and OECD's failure to tell you about it, but simply putting up beauty contests. There's another question that arises to everybody. Everybody says, well, these we use, to get our best data in the US, we use samples. Hey, we got 310 million people, and if NCES runs a scientific longitudinal study that's weighted, whether it's a grade cohort or a beginning post-secondary students cohort or a baccalaureate and beyond cohort, we know how to represent people, and surprise, so do other countries, except you think every other country, even Denmark, uses a full census? Actually, Denmark, you can get an interesting, my experience online, and you can do this yourself because it's in English. You go to StatBank DK, which is an online table generator, and you can cut, start with high school classes and cut 9-year longitudinal studies in a variety of ways. And when you do that, they give you raw numbers. They give you ends. But then I send the figures and analysis to another statistical agency in Denmark, and they say, oh, you're way off. There are more high school graduates than that. I said, what, do you want to quarrel with your own statistical bank? This is what they say. Well, as it turns out, in Denmark and Czech Republic and a variety of other countries, there are a whole bunch of people in secondary school who are the tracking system is uniform. It's not uniform. It's rampant throughout Europe, as you know. And there's a whole bunch of people who are in a secondary school track that takes them out of the higher education marching line altogether and right into labor market. And in terms of the international classification of programs, it's ISCID 3C, which is it's a vocational track, but it's not there are 2 kinds of vocational tracks in Europe. There's one that leads you to higher education and one that doesn't. And this one doesn't, and they weren't counted in StatBank DK. No wonder, so we were just dealing with people who could go to higher education. You have a question? Okay. All right, so One of the issues that comes up is when you're not dealing with that, you get something that Education at a Glance, OECD, calls synthetic ratios of virtual cohorts, which are artificial estimates of what they're trying to talk about. They're not even samples. And they don't tell you about that, and our census, even our census department doesn't tell you about that. Sampling protocols are not uniform. And by the way, Kristen, Eurostat's trying to do this in economics with the labor force surveys too. They realize they're doing 27 countries, and the labor force surveys, economics, the samples in the different countries are not following the same protocols. So it's very difficult. And I turn around and say to, as I will to the World Bank, and I say it to our own data quality campaign, we got to start dealing with reconciliation, and we haven't done so far. And then I think some of the questions you've raised before. It's fog. You go to the Netherlands, and when I get my Dutch friends to tell me what these terms mean, there are 3 different definitions of beginning students. I drove the UK people crazy by pointing out that in the same publication, they offered 2 different figures of total enrollments. And I said, and this is from the Higher Education Statistics Agency in the UK. I said, which one do I use? And they say, the one that's repeated. Please. And I said, well, what do you do with your own department? It's now called the Department of Innovation something in Science. They changed the name. I said, what do you do with their figure, which is different, radically different for beginning students? And they say, and I understand the difference between UK domiciled and everybody, which means some countries have to account for foreign students, and then it depends, how do you define a foreign student, you know, in terms of various ways. And they said, they came back, and the statistics agency says, well, they used a different definition. I mean, at least, you know, we would say, do our do our government departments talk to each other? I think the problem is the same in other countries. Canada, I mean, I have friends at Statistics Canada, or StatCan as we call it, who say, yeah, we can't tell you how many beginning students we have. Why? Well, because the provinces report differently. Oh my God. And graduates are whatever a country says they are. You know, and Sweden will tell you they've got graduates who we wouldn't call graduates because they haven't been awarded a degree. They have basically taken all their coursework, but they have final exams in Sweden, and they haven't taken the final exams. You don't get a degree without a degree qualifying exam. And that was the old way in Germany, and still is in some disciplines. They call it a Staatsexamen. And if you haven't, you can finish all your coursework, and they'll still call you a graduate, even if they haven't given you a degree. We don't do that. We only report people who actually got a piece of paper. And down at the level of associate's degrees, Russia does this. They include trade school certificates. So does Canada. OECD at least acknowledges Canada. Russia is not an OECD country, so they don't bother acknowledging them. But they do in a footnote say Canadian data are inflated. And that's one of the principal reasons. Come on, get me another one. Let me show you the way OECD beats us up. And they love to do this. There's a table, which is in this publication I've given you, on graduation rates. That is, the proportion of people who start out in a bachelor's degree granting institution who actually earn the degree. Number one, they don't tell you, there were 24 countries in this table. They don't tell you how many years they were following from one country to the next. Doesn't take much, just a little column. If you knew that Finland they were following the students for 10 years and they came up with a 70% rate, and in the US they're following, well, I won't use the US, use France. They were following France for 7 years and they came up with 64%, big deal, you know, but they don't even tell you that. Secondly, half of the data are cross-sectional and half of them are true cohorts. And they do tell you that, but they mix them in the same table. We would never allow that in NCES. Absolutely does not meet statistical standards. Doesn't tell you that our 6-year rate, which there is 56%, is the only rate out of 24 that means that you graduated from the same institution you started in. Everybody else is a system graduation rate. And when we sent in, and I was one of the instigators for this, when we sent in a system graduation rate, they put it in an online appendix, Annex 3, page 46, I can tell you where they put it, and what it said, our real graduation rate for 6 years, which is derived from beginning post-secondary students' longitudinal study, is 63% as opposed to 56, and that's a 6-year. They said, oh, those data are old, except you go back to the original table, and Sweden and the Netherlands are using the same period. How come their data is okay and the US data is considered old? It's unacceptable under statistical standards. I regard it as purposeful, absolutely purposeful, pejorative presentation of US higher education attainment. That doesn't mean we're doing terrific. I just want an honest story out there, and one of the things that you see when you take account of all of the background material, and I got it from OECD, I got their input statistical, their spreadsheets from under the table, so I could compare and see what was going on. Let me show you some other things, other differences between it when you go to the National Statistics Agency and match them against Education at a Glance. OECD says for the Netherlands, their graduation rate's 65% in 7 years, but of course in the table they don't tell you it's 7 years. Then you go to the Netherlands Central Bureau for Statistics, and what do you get from them? They break it up by two different types of institutions. It's a binary system. It's got universities and polytechnics. The polytechnics are called, actually, technically, the European term is universities of applied science. They're basically, think of them as our ASCU institutions. They're Hogescholen in the Netherlands. And you get these figures for Hogescholen, full-time, part-time, at least they're taking account of enrollment intensity, and you ask, how the devil does that add up to 65% in 7 years? It doesn't. Sweden is more outrageous. It's unbelievable. This is OECD telling you that in 6 years, the graduation rate in Sweden was 69%. You go to the Swedish Statistical Agency, 54 for full-time students, 44% for everybody. Let me tell you about everybody in Sweden. There's a whole class of students called kursstudenter in Sweden. It's a wonderful concept. It means you enter a Swedish university and you agree to take one course a term. One course at a time. You're a kursstudenter. And you can transfer to full-time status at some time when you feel that you're acclimated to the rhythms where you've got a major. Sweden is one of 2 countries in Europe where you don't enter a major right away. Scotland's the other one. You get a chance to figure out what you want to do. Every other place, you got to pick a major when you enter. But they allow you to do that, and then you can change over to the full-time status, or you can leave the school at some point. It takes the kursstudenter who hang around taking one course a semester a lot longer to graduate. Who are they? They tend to be women in their early 20s who were under gap years. Took the gap years and came in through community education programs to the Swedish system. That's the way it goes. But look at the difference between what OECD told you. This is something I didn't put in this slide, but I should have. They said 69%, that was in 2008, Education at a Glance. In 2009, they said 60%. How can the Swedish, I'm going to take OECD, I'm going to accept them for a minute. How can they drop the Swedish graduation rate from 69 to 60% in 1 year? It's that kind of unacceptable behavior. Finland, 72%. They don't tell you that's a 10-year rate, but take a look what Statistics Finland says for 7.5 years. They too have a binary system. Those polytechnics that they created in the 1990s, 70% of the students graduate, but 58% from the universities. You've got to keep on going back and forth. Who do I believe? Do I believe for Sweden? Do I believe Stockholm? Or do I believe through Duru André Pascal in Paris, which is where OECD is? Who the devil do I believe? I believe Stockholm for Sweden. I believe Helsinki for Finland. I believe The Hague for the Netherlands. That's where my confidence has to lie. And I believe NCES before I believe what OECD does with it. Okay, if you put everybody together, okay, all of these tables for bachelor's degree completion, here's us, 63% in 6 years. Finland, 72 and 10, France, 65, 7. You look at this list and you say, is there really, and if you did a simple graph of this, do you think with access of time and completion, you would see a very tight cluster, is what you would see. So you'd say, hey, these countries really are producing bachelor's degrees at roughly the same rate. So what's the big deal in the beauty contest? And if you Winsorize tracking at 7 years, for example, I picked 7, but you could pick another number if you wished, you'd see that you'd really reinforce it. And the least you can do is Winsorize the data. And I think that Eurostat is going to try to force that on its contributors, but that isn't going to pick up Japan, Canada, Korea, and people outside of the EU 27. Okay, what do I think we should be reporting that we're not? And this is for all of you to consider. And it's not merely, it applies to pre-collegiate education as well as post-collegiate education, as well as post-secondary. One is the principle of inclusion. And that is what? Every country has different groups, subgroups, that are, have low representation in higher education. Different countries have different kinds of subgroups. One of the ones that comes up, for example, consistently in European and Australian, for example, and Canadian formulations are isolated rural populations. What I say to people in this country is if we're concerned with low-income minority students, if we went to used isolated rural instead, who do you think we'd find? In the Mississippi Delta, in the Arroyo Secos of New Mexico, in the Central Valley of California, in the Northwest counties of Minnesota, we'd find a lot of poor minority kids. But at least we'd know where to drive our cars when we went out to solve a problem. And that's one of the things the Europeans have done under Bologna and individually themselves that we have much to learn from, which is geocoding, where your underrepresented populations or your low participation populations. Another category they pay a lot more visible attention to than we do is students with disabilities. It's just that that's the way they do. Some countries with high groups of non-native ethnicities they have different categories for them. The Germans distinguish, for example, between people of non-German extraction who their key marker is where did you graduate from secondary school. And if you graduated in Germany, you may be of Turkish origin or chances are it's Turkish, it's heavily, but also other origins, and you're in with the native Germans. If you finished secondary school in another country, obviously you're not. So that's another population you've got to pay attention to. Income is not as much an issue as it is here because of the differences in the tuition structures. That's why I was going to bring that up. I mean, when you take a look at the cost of higher education in countries where tuition is an unthinkable concept, it's much lower than it is elsewhere. And even though European students complain about the cost of higher education, what they're principally complaining about are the non-tuition aspects of it, housing and student support. So the second issue I think we got to talk about in international data that could make sense for policy is what I call flexibility indicators. That is how flexible, what do you have, alternative entry paths into higher education in the system, and how many people are using those paths? Recognition of prior learning is one. I mean, we've got, in this country, for example, you've got, as we speak today, and I think in Texas you know this well, between 300 and 350,000 active duty military who are registered for courses for credit, in addition to the 1 million veterans that we're handling. They are not full-time students. They are online. They are analogous to migrants. I mean, they'll wind up at your school with 8 transcripts basically, electronic transcripts from everything from University of Maryland, University College, Central Texas Community College is a big provider to the military. Those are two public institutions. Then they got University of Phoenix and American Continental. All the proprietary schools are in the ballgame. And so we've got that kind of thing. Other countries have issues about recognition of prior learning, part-time status, e-learning volume. A story I love to tell about this, about who the alternative paths in is Tele 3, which is the distance education division of the University of Paris 3, okay, Tele 3. And I asked the guy, I said, it's everything, and the University of Paris 3 is a humanities and arts centered university. It's not like 6, which is science and science, Sciences Po, et cetera. Every one of the Paris schools has a different orientation. And the guy says to me, he said, well, you want to register in my university? You got to demonstrate to me that you can't go to school any other way than by distance learning. I said, how do you demonstrate that? Show me a picture of your kids and a pay stub. And between the two of them, literally, that's what he said. He wants the kid, that's the kind of person that they want, a flexibility path through distance education to get into the higher ed system. Show me a picture of your kids, you can do that. Pay stub, you can do that. But you already have a degree, so I can't get you back in, unless you want to take another one. I had enough of that. But, I mean, that's one of the kind of issues that I think are important in terms of taking a look at the volume comparative indicators, because all of those countries are post-industrial societies, and those are the kinds of issues our policymakers in higher education worry about. Inclusion, flexibility is going to serve special populations, and inclusion issues. Lastly, in this, I want, and it's not last, degree qualification, degree quality proxies. The Bologna process has got it in Europe with what are called qualifications frameworks. There is a big qualifications framework that all 46 countries have agreed to. And it's fascinating to read it, because you see there are 5 constructs. Let me just take one of them to look at it. Use of information resources is one of them. Okay, what does that mean at the associate's degree level? The equivalent of our associate's degree? What does it mean at the bachelor's level? What does it mean at the master's level? What does it mean at the doctoral level? And in all cases, it says it's not what the institution provides, but what you demonstrate. So the student will show X at this level, and then you ratchet up the challenge to the next level, the student shows this. Ratchet it up again, the student, okay. They agreed that everybody adopted this. It's called the Dublin Descriptors, the qualification frameworks of the European higher education area. All 46 countries had adopted it. But then they have to produce national versions. And that's a slow process, because then you're dealing with the politics internal to your country, different constituencies, that kind of academic politics, it's even worse. But then you have to self-certify and show, oh yeah, I've got my national qualifications framework, and here's how it relates to the overall European qualifications framework. It's a quality indicator. When you get done, it says something. We are demonstrating, almost as a statement of warranty, that you and you and you and you have done these things. And if you didn't do them, we didn't give you a degree. That is the implicit statement that lies behind it. Okay, something else I think we need is vertical penetration. I've mentioned this before. Comparative indicators, particularly bachelor's to master's degree, bachelor's to graduate school in this country. In Europe, now that they've got a 3-cycle degree structure, at least show us bachelor's to master's. And guess what's happening? When they took the old 5-year degrees in English in Europe and broke them into 3+2, guess what the European students are doing? They're getting master's degrees. It's the same thing as the old structure. I mean, 80% of German university students are going on from the bachelor's to the master's. In Switzerland, it's 90%. From the German Fachhochschulen, that is the institutions of applied science, the ASCUs, it's 40% going on. I mean, to get a master's degree. These kids are going to come into the labor market, the global labor market, with masters after their names. Our kids are going to be still stuck with bachelor's degrees. I don't advocate that the U.S. go to a 3-year bachelor's degree because we do a miserable job in high school. And if you want to know how badly, go to, you want to see it live, don't trust me, go to simia.it. That's the Italian website for students from other countries who want to come study in Italy, and take a look at what they say for U.S. high school graduates. What you have to present to enter an Italian university like Trento, which is a good one, or Florence or whatever. What you have to present, I can count the number of high school graduates in this country on my fingers and toes who can meet Simia IT's qualifications, and they all live in New Jersey. Why do they live in New Jersey? Because they got Italian-speaking grandparents upstairs, and you got to know all the lyrics to, I don't know, pick your opera, in order to qualify. They know that. All right, so this is part of something else we need to deal with, is the consequences of secondary school tracking in other countries, dividing qualifying and non-qualifying populations, and their primary concerns of OECD countries. And beauty contests are not. Okay, I think I've covered everything that's on here. You got a copy of this thing. If not, you can log on and track of this. Oh, by the way, I mentioned the countries where 40% of the secondary school population is in these programs that tracks them out of the higher education queue completely. And I think we got to get back and deal with that, as well as what the de facto impact of U.S. curricula on tracking students out of the queue. Here's the data I just gave you on the Germans, in terms of how many are continuing on from the bachelor's to the master's degree. My point about all of this at the end of it, without overloading you with data, and I usually do that, I think I was kind today, comparatively speaking, is that everybody's going to continue to use OECD data. And they know that there are problems with it, and we got to present comparative data in the future in ways we're going to feel confident. And we do it not to say that one country does better than another, rather that in a way that we understand what we all have to do to improve the education of our students in a world without borders. I mean, really, that's why I emphasized inclusion, flexibility, quality, vertical penetration. Those are the indicators we need. And with your help, we may actually get around to creating them someday. All right, so I think, if I'm correct, I'm giving you some references. And I didn't write them all. But I think that some of them are I think these are very important. The Barrow and Lee study is classic economics in its own way. The critique of the international classification of education, I think, is worthy of anybody's study, particularly at the secondary school level as well as higher education. They really got to redo that volume. They are working on that system. It's called ISKID, and they're working on it now. And OECD does do good work occasionally. This particular volume on demography of higher education, looking forward. Did I say 2010? No, it should have been 2030. You can correct that. It's actually 2030. It is 2010 now. It's the demography. Ding, ding, Clifford, wake up. But that's the references. Okay? All right, we had some burning questions before. I hope to take some non-burning questions now. Yes, sir, we're back.
Slide previous,
Slide previous.
down at the bottom.
Yes, sir.
World without borders, that's a political comment. What are you trying to say?
It's not a political comment, it's an economic reality. In case you haven't noticed it, we've got a world that has no economic borders. Otherwise, what happened in the past 3 years would have been confined. It wasn't.
Economic borders.
Yeah. I mean, you got a labor market that's global. You got an economy that's global. Yeah, politically, yes, you still have borders. Sorry, I'll change that. Yes, sir.
Many folks in Washington make a big deal about science, math, and engineering participation by U.S. students compared to students in other countries? Should we be suspicious of...
That's my next paper. My next paper will be delivered on that topic specifically. It's not my next paper, but it's this spring. It will be delivered at the Association for Institutional Research Forum in June. And basically, you come at that in a couple of ways. First of all, understanding, first question, what do people call science, math, engineering, and technology? What are they labeling? Here are some things for you. Urban studies is classified as engineering. Excuse me? How does that happen? Because it's classified under architecture, which is then aggregated up. You should see how this happens. Geography. I didn't say geology. I said geography is classified as a natural science. Now, excuse me, with all due respect to quantitative geographers, that is not a natural science. And then for specific fields, I mean, I asked NCES for data under 6-digit zip codes. And you start getting down to the 6-digit zip code levels and start taking a look at some of the titles. And then you've got to go online to institutions in other countries that offer programs with similar titles in their language, okay? And then go find out what they're teaching. And some of the stuff is not science and engineering. Just isn't. And how it could, because they classify it the way they do, it gets aggregated that way. And if you remember, back in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s, we were scared witless in this country of 200,000 Russian master's degrees in engineering, the Russian, Soviet master's degrees in engineering, until somebody had the brains to go to figure out what those people were studying, which it turns out qualified them to fix tanks in Siberia. Okay, that's what a master's degree in engineering in the Soviet Union of the late 70s and 80s meant. And so we have simpler challenges where you've got to go online, take a look at what some of the stuff that's being classified as science and engineering is. In the engineering area, sorting out engineering technologies in particular from engineering, and then saying what of these technologies, when you look at them carefully, in the US as well, are being classified as science and engineering, which shouldn't be. You know, I mean, it's the same kind of thing. I would ask you whether, to take a look at business school degrees in information management should be classified as computer science, or whether there's something else. You have to look at what precisely is being studied. This is not an easy job, I can tell you that. I'm there now. Need language help too. Yeah.
What can we do to help? I mean, we have data here in Texas, for example, on all the students who in pre-K through college, and workforce data as well. So can we help with your statistical analyses or help with your study by acting as an example for other places, or giving you some straight data?
Well, what you're raising a data within the U.S. state data quality issue, and that's a continual evolution within the U.S. And I don't know whether you've made presentations to the DQC crowd, but that's here, and only in time will that get to the international level as an exemplar of the kind of work that has to be done at the local level. Now, we are, again, because the U.S. is A, the biggest ship in the harbor, and B, a federal system, we're playing and we're singing in a different key, so to speak, than unified systems in Norway or the smaller countries, or even larger countries like Italy, that doesn't have a federal setup, or Japan. But they're facing different kinds of problems, because you saw the demographic projections for some of those places are a real serious business. There are going to be, look at the projected size of the school-age population in Russia and in Japan and in South Korea and in Poland in 10 years. I mean, the shrinkage is incredible. So they're going to be working with a more selective group to begin with. And it's a question of could afford to have children and who couldn't. And then you start branching out to the outside of OECD. You're looking at China, which had a controlled population issue. China's problem is not growth. India's problem is growth. They're going to be bigger than China. I mean, you know, for those of you who don't know, by the way, Vietnam is going to be as big as Russia in population by 2040. And, you know, people just look around and say, really? Look at it. I mean, these people, you know, even if you take a low projection of demographics, our Census Bureau always gives you 3 projections: high, medium, average, and low. And you take the low ones, you're going to see this kind of change in the world. And so I say to people, economic, whether it's economic or otherwise, in the world where the borders count, you know, within country, where you could do the analysis, is going to be a world of shifting advanced knowledge input as we move forward. And it's precisely because our economies are so connected and our workforces are so connected, and you don't have to go to another country to be in an international workforce. You're doing it right from your desk. So our kids have got to know how to do that. And I don't care if English is the default second language of the world. You've got to know how the rest of them work. You know how English became the default second language. Okay, tell me where I'm wrong. Number one, a computer hard drive in 1984, and the major software packages that were built on it afterwards, including Java. Java's got 60 core words in English. You can't get them any other way. Translate the rest of Java into another language, and English syntax. Air traffic control and avionics, because we were making the planes. And the mass marketing of entertainment, okay? And the one that most people usually forget, we were the language of occupation in Europe, Japan, Korea, etc. Okay, now, my European friends will say, well, London was the center of finance starting in the end of the 19th century, and so that was reinforced English, secondly. And then to all of that, I add, from a linguist point of view, it's the easiest language to learn. There are no gender rules. There's no declensions. Our conjugations are pretty simple. It's an analytic language. You're not waiting like you do in German for a word at the end of the sentence that tells you, vorstellen, ein. By the time you hear the ein, you're already in the next county, and then you can figure out what it means at the end. Russian is the same way in terms of synthetic languages, where you're waiting for the conclusion of meaning. I don't know how they teach their kids to think that way, you know. And you listen. What's always fascinating is you listen to kids learning, little children interacting with their parents in a language other than English, and you're saying, now, wait a minute, and you know something about the language, and you get to something like German or Russian, which you know is synthetic, and how the little kid picks up that kind of syntax. And Chinese, Mandarin anyway, has no grammar, but lots of syntax. So, and how the child picks up tonal differences is unbelievable, you know, in the execution of Mandarin Chinese. Anyway, there are a lot of interesting issues when you get beyond the OECD. We won't deal with them today. Some other time. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.